in Cyberland. So you are William E Simpson II, right? Okay. Okay. So how did you get to live in the wilderness among the animals, which is like my dream life? I'm living with the animals too, but not the horses. So how did you get involved in all of that?
Well, it was kind of by happenstance. I had just returned from a 4-year sailing voyage down the Sea of Cortez, and that was the wilderness at sea. And I liked the isolation, being around the animals, the whales, of course, down there, the whales, the dolphins. And when I came back from that, basically looking for a place in the wilderness was on my priority list, and ran across a large acreage up here on the California-Oregon border. And I didn't know there was horses here. It just was a beautiful place, and bought it, and then moved in, and then realized there was horses here. And then as I started researching, it turned out that the horses had been here for hundreds of years, and there's horse fossils here. And really, it should have been an HMA under the law, because there's ample evidence of horse fossils as well as cultural archaeology that shows wild horses had been here for a very long time. And plus, you look at the morphology of our horses here, they're really compact and powerful. They're we call them mountain ponies, because a lot of them are quite powerful, and they have kind of like they're built like a rhinoceros. They're very short backed. You can tell they haven't been bred like horses that are used for human utility. You know, you want a horse that has a long back for a saddle, for instance, or there's certain characteristics that you look for when you're breeding horses or going to buy a horse for use. And so these horses are pretty, I mean, you wouldn't want to try to put a saddle on one of these horses because they hardly have any back. I mean, they're really short, and of course they're not that big. A lot of these horses are maybe 14, 15 hands tops, but they're very intelligent, and they survive up in these mountains really well. So it was by accident that I moved in here with them, and then once I got here, you know, having come from a ranching background and having had domestic horses, I started looking at them like, okay, these guys are not acting like the horses that I've known growing up. You know, they have a different behavior. They act more like deer. And over time, they started to accept me on the landscape, and I could get closer and closer to them because they saw I wasn't a threat. And it took a long time to build that trust. But once I built that trust, then the bonds were formed, and I became accepted to where I could walk up to these big stallions and not, you know, get hammered, or I could go to you know, around the mares and the babies, and, you know, generally accepted. They allow me to do social grooming, and that gives me some unique opportunities to observe and record a lot of their behavioral ecology. You know, what do they do? How do they benefit the landscape, and things like that. And it's been really beneficial.
So it was actually by accident. Interesting. Well, you certainly lucked out. From the pictures that I've seen, it almost looks like you are bonding with them, you know, hugging them and getting very close. So obviously you gain their trust. Let's talk about something that most people really, because this was news to me, the benefit of wild horses and wildfires, the prevention and how all that happens, because that's not something I really had even thought of or heard about. And excuse me, as you know, wildfires out west, they just devastate, you know, so much of the land, and then all the money, you know, taxpayer money that we spend, kind of as an afterthought. We don't really do a whole lot of prevention, it seems, but it's always like, oh, there's a wildfire, and then we have to douse the fire, and we don't really think of preventing it. So you came up with kind of a way that we could prevent it using wild horses, of all things. Tell us about that.
Right. So you're referring to Wild Horse Fire Brigade, and you know, having watched these horses for a while. I started doing some research, and then I ran into a study by Professor William J. Ripple at Oregon State. He's a professor of forestry up there, and his study is about the collapse of large herbivores around the world and what happens when you lose your large herbivores. And so as I read through his study, there's a whole section on fire. And I found that to be quite interesting because around the world, on every continent where they conducted their research, and there was multiple universities involved in this study, and it's published. And so anyway, on every continent where they had a loss of large herbivores, catastrophic wildfire evolved. So there was a definite connection that he made between the amount of fuel on the landscape that was ungrazed. Once you lose your big herbivores, then the fuel grows up, it doesn't get grazed, and then it sits there, dries in the sun, and it's ready to accept any kind of source of ignition. And so I found that study, and then I started looking at what was going on in California. And because I live right on the Oregon-California border in the wilderness area up here, so I'm actually 1 mile or two, actually about 2 miles from the Oregon border. That's how close we are to Oregon here. And so I was looking at the situation in California. Well, I started researching the herbivory here, as it's called, and found out that California is down about 1.5, maybe 2 million deer over the last 50 years. So I started doing some math. I got out the calculator. Each deer eats about 7 pounds of grass and brush a day. And if, let's say, you have 1.5 million deer that are gone now, those deer that are now missing were eating almost 2 million tons of grass and brush every year. And that's just California. So 2 million tons of grass and brush. If you've seen a big semi full of like alfalfa going down the road, a truck and trailer load, that's only 80 tons. So we're talking about 2 million tons of grass and brush, and that's every year. It comes back every year. So, and with climate change, and here's where climate change really comes into effect, and I went through, I'm a merchant marine officer, retired, and so I went through fire training. And in fire training, you have what is known as a fire triangle. And so, one side of the triangle is fuel. You got to have fuel, you got to have ignition, you got to have oxygen. And climate change is overstated almost across the board, because if you don't have fuel, it doesn't matter how hot the climate is, you're not going to have catastrophic fire. That's the bottom line. If the fuel is gone, there is no fire. If oxygen is gone, well, of course, we can't control the amount of oxygen, but we can control the amount of fuel on the landscape. So looking at the herbivory and in California, let's say 2 million tons of annual grass and brush, now we have a warmer climate. Okay, well, what that does is it dries that grass and brush sooner because it's ungrazed. It stays dry longer, and then there's more opportunity for fire. And then when you have prodigious amounts of this fuel, it's actually an accelerant, because what people don't realize is grass and brush burns hotter than the heavy fuels. It flashes, it burns. That's why you have to have what you call kindling. If you put logs in your fireplace, you could sit there with a butane torch all day. You're not going to light it. You got to have kindling. Well, that's what the grass and brush is. It burns hot, it lights other fuels, and it carries the fire to other fuels. And in fact, I've started studying California fire forensics. Cal Fire publishes at Incident Web. You can look at the causation of fires, the fuels. They actually list the fuels on all these big fires, and almost uniformly you'll find grass and brush is one of the key fuels, or the main fuel. For instance, in the Sonoma fire, it was primarily grass and brush, and that fire just devastated an entire community at Coffey Park, which were modern, up to code, fire resistant homes. Many had tile roofs and things designed by architects in San Francisco to be fire resistant. Well, they had a big grass and brush fire in Sonoma County. It hit Coffey Park. And of course, they have streets and sidewalks. This isn't out in the wooey. This is like, right down in the community. That fire devastated. The grass and brush just devastated every single house. So you don't need forests to destroy everything in sight. Grass and brush is perfectly adequate to wipe stuff out. And we saw that, of course, here in Oregon recently with the Talent and Phoenix fire that wiped out 800 homes, primarily grass and brush. CAL FIRE calls these fuels, they're called 1 hour class fuels, and they're the ones that grass and brush, and that's everything that's a 1/4 inch in diameter and smaller. So these are fine fuels, and these are the fuels that are the key fuels in every fire, and are also the ones that they look at when they're establishing fire danger on the landscape. You know, the arrow that shows fire danger goes from green to red. That's a function of how dry the fine fuels are, and so they're the key fuels. So the point here is that when you've got your big herbivores are gone. In California, we're down 1.5 million. Oregon's down about 200,000. That's why we have the evolution of this catastrophic fire. It's not because the climate is hotter. It's because we've lost our herbivory, and they're the natural fuel reducers. And another example of what's going on is you look at down by Yosemite, there was an entire forest of fire-resistant trees. So these are trees that are fire-evolved conifers that actually need fire for reproduction. Okay, and it opens up the cones and things. They need fire, and they've been here for thousands of years, right? So they've seen warmer climates, they've seen colder climates. These are living beings that have been on the planet for thousands of years. They've seen it all, and they need fire to reproduce. Well, they had a fire down there in California, there in Yosemite, that killed every one of these trees, every single tree, gone, burned. And it's because the fire was so hot, because of all this fuel that was ungrazed. We lost our deer, so all this fuel built up, caught on fire. The fire was too much for these trees that needed fire, killed them all. So, and that was the National Geographic did a story about that particular fire. And so anyway, looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, well, how do we reproduce how do we bring back our herbivory? How do we get the deer back? You know, you can't go down to Cervids R Us and get a bunch of deer and move them out in the landscape. You know, it's going to take decades and decades to bring them back. We're going to have a moratorium on hunting. We're going to have to be really careful about, you know, vehicular accidents and disease. We have chronic wasting disease spreading that's killing deer. So that's a really long road to bring back the herbivory, the natural herbivory. And I started thinking, I said, well, we got these horses that are sitting in these corrals. We're spending $100 million a year rounding them up and feeding them in these warehouses, basically. We could just take those horses and put them into these wilderness areas, because we don't, and that's the other thing I wanted to say. In California alone, to reproduce the missing deers grazing in California, so the 1.5 million deer that were grazing 2 million tons of grass and brush every year, to reproduce that grazing capacity, we would need 500,000 horses. We don't have 500,000 horses across the whole US in captivity, running free. So what are we going to do? You know, well, and a professor of forestry told me that. He read my plan. He says, well, Bill, it's a great plan, but you mentioned California and the missing deer.
Right. To
reproduce what those deer were doing, you need 500,000 horses. And I go, I know, we don't have them. And so what are we going to do? Well, what we do is we put the horses in the most sensitive, critical areas that need protection. So, you know, we've got places in these big designated wilderness areas, and they're designated wilderness because you have ancient trees, you have, you know, special endangered wildlife, flora and fauna that need protection. So that's where we put the limited horses we have. We have to protect those special assets, and the horses can do the job. They get the fuel down, and you'll hear comments from people like, oh, well, you know, I don't want to put horses into an area that might have a fire. Excuse me, E. cabalis evolved in North America 1.7 million years ago. Over 1.7 million years, they've seen plenty of fire. big fires, little fires, climate change. They've seen it all, and they were still here. So that's just somebody talking who hasn't got an education in natural history. Another thing you'll say, I saw a comment recently. Somebody goes, "Oh, well, you know, some of these wilderness areas, there's big mountains and they're, you know, 8,000-9,000 feet tall." Excuse me, have you ever heard of the big summit herd in Oregon and the Ochocos? Those horses have been there for hundreds of years, living happily at 8,000 feet with 20 feet of snow in the winter. You know, you get the problem we have in the advocacy is there are too many people who have a voice who are ignorant on the subjects. They're not educated. They don't have the background. They do not have the science or the empirical experience with behavioral ecology of wild horses. So it's kind of like the blind leading the blind in a lot of these discussions you see on the internet. And the problem the problem we need to overcome is we need to, I mean, everybody should have a opportunity to comment, but the leadership in discussions has to be by people with the experience. You know, that's why the passengers on the 747 don't get to fly the airplane. They're not pilots. Okay, and that's the problem we have. We've got people that are wannabe pilots that want to be up in the cockpit telling them how to fly that aircraft, but they don't have the experience and training it takes. It's the same way with natural resource management. We have too many people, you know, spouting off with all these ideas that just don't make sense. They're not based in any kind of science or experience. So
That's very
how
true.
it kind of came about.
That's very, very true. Let me ask you, let me just play devil's advocate, because we all know ranching is a huge problem on public lands, but also it affects climate with, I'll just say in layman's term, the belching, the farting, and the pooping of the cows. They destroy the land, the water, they create greenhouse gas. But as you mentioned, with these kind of wannabe leaders that don't really have the background in science, and they don't have the kind of personality, shall we say, that want to learn or go to somebody that might have a different opinion and go, you know, that might make sense, kind of thing. So just playing devil's advocate, because you know this is going to come up. What would your answer be to like the ranching industry when they say, well, we're not going to have, you know, what it's going to sound like, millions of horses? If you look at the whole West, right? Well, we have all of these cattle and they graze. So how would you counter their response to that?
So yeah, I just wrote a 3,200 word article about all of that. And so what we have going on is we've got a battle between wild horses and consumerism. And see, consumers in America, that's all of us. I mean, even though I have a very low carbon footprint, you know, I have my own solar power, my own water, and all, you know, I still have to buy products and services. Right. So consumerism is what's creating the demand on public lands for resources, and resources off public land is not just limited to livestock. It's also, you know, extraction industry, you know, oil, gas, minerals that supply all the products that Americans want. And Americans want more stuff than ever before. Mm-hmm. So where is it going to come from? So you have this, it's not the ranchers, and it's not the BLM, and it's not the DOI or USDA. What it is the giant conglomerate corporations who are providing the products and services to consumers in America, who are basically controlling the politics of America. When you think about the money, okay, a lot of people don't look at economics. I look at economics because I used to run an internet company, I had 100 employees, and so, you know, involved with Wall Street and all that. So when I look at the economics here, I'm looking at, for instance, Big Pharma. Okay, Big Pharma, they make $4.5 trillion a year. Okay, that's just one sector, 4.5 trillion. To put that in perspective, the entire military budget of the United States is only $760 billion. So 760 billion compared to 4.5 trillion. Okay, the military budget, all of it together, is a tiny fraction of what Big Pharma makes. Okay, then you've got agriculture. Agriculture in America is $2.5 trillion. So, and when you look at these two sectors together, you're approaching $10 trillion, because the numbers I have are actually, they're bigger than they were when I did the research a couple of years ago. So they're approaching $10 trillion in annual revenue in America. Okay, that's just America. Way bigger budget than the whole US government. Huge. I mean, these two sectors are monsters. And they're made up of these giant corporations, and these are multinational corporations who, when you look at the total amount of money, about $10 trillion, just even a tiny speck, for instance, a grain of sand off that beach of money is more than enough money to buy all the politicians and lobbyists that they need to run our government, which is exactly what they do. It has nothing to do with political parties or anything. It's about money, and the guy who has the money makes the rules, and these guys have the money. So what they're doing is they're managing land in a way that serves their business in consumerism. And the ranchers are providing meat. 97% of Americans want meat because I became a vegetarian in college in 71. Well, that was, a long time ago, almost 50 years ago. So, and when I became a vegetarian, I'm thinking that, okay, there's 2% of us now that are vegetarians. If we take the leadership, maybe we can make a change. Well, here we are almost 50 years later. Guess what? 3% of Americans are vegetarians. So that ain't working. That ain't working for us. So we got to acknowledge the fact that Americans want livestock products. That's a fact. And then they want everything else. They want Tesla cars. Well, you look at they got copper, cobalt, lithium, all these phones and computers, lithium, cobalt, copper. Where is that coming from? Well, it's coming off the land. That's where it's coming from. And so, consumerism is driving the competition for public land use. It's not livestock. It's not, this guy or that guy. It's the big corporations and consumers. And then the guys are down below are just middlemen, just trying to make a living, giving people what they want. Okay, so we have to really analyze the problem and keep it in real perspective instead of trying to demonize one person or another when it's really corporate greed and it's consumerism. It's people want more stuff. Okay, if people use less stuff, then everything would be a lot different. But that's not we're not gonna change. We're not gonna suddenly, ask everybody to change their morality, to give up, accept less, do less, basically that's not going to happen. People want more stuff. In fact, Amazon and the internet is actually accelerating the speed at which products are sold to people. So the demand is going up exponentially. So what do we do about it? Well, we look at like the HMAs and, for instance, herd management areas. There's some problems with HMAs. And the first problem that I've run into, because I have a background in science, I graduated high school, went to Oregon State as a pre-med science major, studied a lot of science. And so I'm looking at these HMAs and I'm seeing a lot of problems with that, because when the wild horse, the Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act was passed in 71, that act was drawing upon science that was developed in the 50s and the 60s.
Right.
Okay, so the science from that era is obsolete today. We know so much more. For instance, back in the 50s and 60s, everybody was saying that, oh yeah, wild horses went extinct 17,000 years ago. Well, that's not true. In fact, there's a science study that just came out a couple days ago from McMaster University that says that, oh, we found fossil records of horses in North America that are 5,000 years old now. Oh, excuse me. Now suddenly the math is off by 12,000 years. So there's a lot of paleoecology that's coming forward that's changing our understanding of what was going on in the landscape here. And so we need to go back and reevaluate HMAs and determine, using our new paleoecology, in other words, looking at the ground, looking at the fossil records and determining what animals were there. Because, 5,000 years ago in the landscape, that's just a snapshot. That's, in the terms of evolution, it's really no different than it is today. 5,000 years ago on the landscape, you analyze it and what was living then? You know, were there horses? Were there, what was there? And then if you have areas that show no previous habitation by equids, those are probably not good HMAs. But we have other areas where we have a lot of evidence that equids had, that was their natural habitat, like the Pryor Mountains, for instance. There's horse fossils there. Where I am, there's horse fossils. The horses have always been here. These horses up here in the mountains are grazing over the bones of their ancestors. Doesn't get any more natural than that. So we have to take today's science and go back and look carefully, because we may be fighting over areas for no reason at all. Because if they're not a real habitat of wild equids, why fight over it? Okay, and especially when you're making a deal with these big corporations, if you can make concessions and you say, okay, I've analyzed this HMA, you know, using our modern technology, there's never been equids there before until they got dislocated there by the cattle industry 300 years ago. And that's what's happened. You know, when they used to run cattle 300 years ago, all the way up until just recently in the last 100 years, they would run hundreds and thousands of head of cattle, and they'd also run horses with the cattle, just like livestock. They'd round them up, they'd get them from Native Americans, they would round them up. And because they needed those horses, because they would ride their horses into the ground, these big cattle pushes, they were riding their horses night and day. And so they'd go lame and they'd break legs and this, that, the other thing. So they'd need a new mount. I mean, these cowboys were riding their horses hard, not like pleasure riding. They were using them like a pickup truck. And so they had to have a lot of extra horses available. And they'd keep a bunch of horses by the cattle. And then if their horse went down, they'd get another horse and break it and saddle train it. And then, because they knew how to do it pretty quick. And so they used them quite often. So over hundreds of years of livestock and big cattle migrations to take them to market from grazing areas, horses got distributed all over the place. And then in December 71, when they started drawing boxes, well, anywhere you find horses, they're now protected. Bingo. Well, those horses got dislocated there. That isn't, you know, I'm looking at the ground. There's no evidence that horses ever lived here in the past. So just because you moved them there suddenly, were there tigers in the New York Zoo? Maybe we should draw a box around the New York Zoo and call it a tiger habitat, because look, there's a tiger there now. No, it doesn't make sense, okay? So we need to go back and evaluate the HMAs with a modern scientific perspective. And then instead of fighting over areas that we shouldn't be fighting over, we should go to these, you know, work with these organizations, the big corporations, and say, look, you guys want to have this area. We find that there's never been horses there in the past. Let's work together. You help us move horses where they need to be in the wilderness, where you're not going to be doing, because a designated wilderness area, that's protected. You can't, no motorized vehicles, you know, there's endangered flora and fauna, you know, you can only hike around in there. You can't do prescribed burns. You can't dump chemicals. So managing fire in a designated wilderness is extremely difficult. There's never going to be mineral extraction. There's never going to be livestock in these areas. Plus, there's a lot of predators up there. And that's important because on the landscape today, and a lot of the HMAs, over these 300 years of cattle management on the landscape, the cowboys killed off all the predators.
Yes.
And they had to, because if they're eating your sheep and your calves, you're not making any money. So they got rid of them, and then that's continued right up until today. The USDA has professional hunters that go out and just, you know, anytime there's predators showing up in these grazing areas, they wipe them out. So that's bad for the horses, because when you separate a prey-predator relationship, see, the lions, the bears, the wolves, the coyotes co-evolve with wild horses, and because they're co-evolved predators, they're uniquely equipped to find a horse that has a genetic defect, or that's sick or diseased, or that's too old or weak. And they take out the genetic weakness. That's natural selection. They take that out, and that preserves the vigor of the species. So when you manage wild horses in the absence of their co-evolved predators, you're actually doing them a huge disservice. And then on top of that, when you're engaging in selective breeding with PZP, now you're even adding insult to injury, because now what you're doing is you've got humans deciding which animals get to breed and which ones don't. That's the first step in domestication. So you have all these ignorant advocates out there with shooting mares with PZP, not realizing what are they doing? They've engaged in the domestication of our wild horses. They're engaged in selective breeding. And not only that, what's even worse, that's bad, but it gets worse, because the way PZP works is it works the best on mares with really good immune systems who react really well to the PZP, so they don't conceive. The mares who have a weak immune system can still foal, and then they have a baby that also has a weak immune system. So over time, you end up with a herd of horses that all have really a weak immune, because you're breeding for that now. You're selective breeding for weak immunity, and suddenly you got some disease that normally doesn't hurt wild horses, like pigeon flu or something that comes through, and boom, suddenly it wipes out all the wild horses because you've been breeding for a weak immune system for, decades. They claim PZP is fine. Well, in terms of genetics, you have to look at multiple, you need to go out like 50 years to see what the ultimate genetic effect of a drug is on a species. It doesn't, the adverse effects don't necessarily manifest in 1 or 2 generations.
Right.
So, but we know from science that when you engage in selective breeding with PZP, you're domesticating the horses and you're breeding for a weak immune system. Those are the other things that are really bad about it. So you're taking the wild out of the wild horse. And it's just so, you look at the Virginia range, for instance, that American Wild Horse Campaign holds out as the cookie cutter model that we should use across the United States. Well, that's just obtuse, because now what they've done is they've created basically a herd that's becoming domesticated, and it's almost like a petting zoo. It's like what Netta DeMeo has down there in Lompoc. She's got 400 horses on 1,000 acres. That's not a natural setup. I mean, it's a sanctuary, but you can't look at that as a model that should be, sanctuaries need to be used for immediate rescues. We got, of course, 7 million domestic horses, and at any given time, there's thousands of those that need rescue. They're good horses, but the owners can't afford them, so they end up in slaughter. And these are good horses that are trained, that are, could be good companions or friends to people. So we have all those horses that are going to slaughter. So Wild Horse Fire Brigade, when you think about it, we're doing a lot of different things here. We're opening up land as a concession to the big corporations, that land that was never used by horses in past history. We're just conceding that with kind of an agreement, saying that you support us with rewilding horses into these other areas that you're not going to use, the designated wilderness. Everybody wins on that, especially the horses, because if there's 110 million acres of designated wilderness in America, 110 million acres. If we just use 20 million acres, the most critical, ecologically sensitive acreage of that 110 million, 20 million acres, we could rewild 100,000 horses. And then they would be truly wild and free. And because they're rewilded back into a naturally balanced ecosystem, their predators control population the way it was for millions of years before we all showed up thinking we know how to do it better than evolution. So we restore the natural balance in these critical wilderness areas. And at the same time, we end the range war. Basically, these guys get to use the land that we see has never been used for horses. Horses never used it. And we preserve the HMAs that are valid, because we do have valid HMAs. And so through this mutual agreement and understanding of the real facts, not emotions, not, and we have to look at economics, because taxpayers are paying for this whole, talk about a debacle. Taxpayers are getting screwed over on this. So, and these big gold-plated advocates, donation-funded advocates, they don't want a real solution, which is why they push PZP. In my opinion, They like the gravy train. They want to show you the dramatic pictures of roundups and little babies that have got their hooves worn off and broken legs and dead horses, and then show you the donate button, and donate here because, they're pulling on people's heartstrings to feed their own needs. These people pay themselves, a lot of them, like CEOs. So when you look at their IRS 990 forms, you look at the money they spend on themselves, it's crazy. And so what do these big organizations think about Wild Horse Fire Brigade? They don't like it, because what happens is it ends their business model, and then they have to go get real jobs. They just can't sit around rattling the tin cup all day showing terrible pictures of dying horses. So
I wanted to ask you,
if they really want. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask you because there was a particular one person, and she is all over the Facebook groups. I don't know if this was her original thought or if someone told her this, but she talks about Assateague Island. I've been to Assateague Island. Granted, full disclosure, not in 20 years, so I don't know what's happened since, but I spent quite a lot of time in Assateague Island all through the 90s. And I talked to rangers there when they were actually talking about this thing that they were going to try, birth control. The thing about Assateague Island, and I basically called her out and I said, well, that's not fair and that's not honest comparison, because like the Virginia range, she was holding it up. Oh, if we could just do Assateague Island. So I'll just get to that in a minute. But when I was there, they were talking about possibly using some form of birth control. These were rangers, they weren't, scientists, kind of to control the population. And at the time, I don't know if this is still true, but at the time, the horses in Assateague Island National Seashore were divided into two. One was going to get this experimental birth control, and I don't think they told me at the time what it was. I might not have known. And the other section were actually owned by the fire department. For the Assateague is like divided into a wildlife refuge. I can't pronounce the name of the refuge, Shinanatik or something. Anyway, it's a refuge. Oftentimes it's closed down because of nesting shorebirds, so horses don't go there. So the fire department would take the foals, and I can only hope find them good homes. And that's how they did like a fundraiser. So they kind of had two things going on. So when she brought this up, holding it up, oh, if we could just emulate this, I said, well, it's not an honest comparison, because Assateague Island is very tiny geographically. They're basically landlocked. The horses have nowhere to go. They can't expand out. So you only have two options, which is the birth control or doing something with the foals. So that nullifies any kind of argument that she would have. Also on Assateague Island, there is a lot of human traffic year round. So those horses have a lot of eyes on them. So if they have an infection or some kind of negative reaction, any given day, somebody could spot that and the horse could get some kind of medical care. I said, well, first of all, there was no follow-up at all with the wild horses, aside from the fact that they're spread over like 10 states and millions of acres. There's no follow-up from the Bureau of Land Management or Forest Service or anybody, right? There's no transparency, so we don't really know who these veterinarians are. We don't know what's going on. They use several different forms of birth control. There's the PZP, there's the PZP-22. I don't know if that's what they call the native. I mean, people throw things out, who knows what's really going on. They use Gonacon, at least for a couple of years, which comes from the USDA. So my concern is, the Wildlife Services, USDA, they view animals as, dead now or dead in the future. So they have no vested interest in animal welfare. And then IUDs, which who would think IUDs in wild horses, they fall out, but they can also cause scarring and sterility. So none of these advocate groups, they're like latched onto the PCP, and they don't really mention these other things. And when you bring them up, it's like crickets, kind of thing. But this whole thing about Assateague Island, I pointed out that you can't possibly make any kind of a comparison. And it's been a couple of days. I'm still waiting for a response on that. But the whole thing with the fertility, it does seem like the moment you agree to that, whether you think you're doing it or not, you kind of accept the overpopulation justification, that the government uses, which, as you pointed out, not only are we not overpopulated, but we are gravely underpopulated as far as the wild horses, right? If we want to really bring back some kind of healthy ecosystem. I'm curious, what about like the local fire departments and like the national, there's like a National Fire Department Association. What is their take or feeling on wild horses as a preventative measure for wildfires?
Well, okay, so that was a lot, and I'll try to unpack some of those things a little bit here. I agree with you. Assateague Island is not a fair comparison because first of all, it's a landlocked population that it's highly unnatural. That most of those horses actually swam to shore off of a lot of the original boats that came in from Europe when we were populating America, the Spaniards and stuff. They used to try to basically drop the horses off in the water and let them swim to shore. So, they would, and some of the horses ended up on that island. And of course they stuck around because there was grass and stuff and water. But these horses on that island are an isolated population. You've got limited land mass. There's no natural predators there. So you've got a situation that really, if you just stand back, what would end up happening is, and you didn't do anything, there would be a lot of horses that would starve to death because they'll have babies, and they'll be, eventually the population will get to the point where there will be limited grass resources or food, and that will limit who lives and dies. And then the strongest, so eventually what would happen is over time, and it would be kind of cruel to watch this, but nature would work it out. There would end up being a smaller population based on the amount of resources, but at the expense of a lot of horses dying over time and being weak, attacked by illnesses and so forth. Now, having said that, so again, we get back to, okay, using PZP. As soon as you're doing that, now you're domesticating those horses. You're engaged in breeding control. So, artificial controls over wildlife is just not right. Okay, you can't have, it's so unnatural to have wild horses. And Assateague, I don't even want to talk about it because it's like a zoo. It's just kind of like horses in a zoo. They're stuck in a confined area. So what do you do when they have babies? You got to either keep the babies, find a home for the baby, or treat the females with some sort of a drug that renders them sterile or infertile. And that's the only way you can manage it, because you're dealing with the economics of a zoo. You only have so much space, so much money. In the case of wildlife, though, it's a whole different conversation. Wildlife needs to be unfettered. You can't meddle. As soon as you meddle with wildlife, it's no longer wildlife. Now all of a sudden it's starting to become some form of a domesticated version, like domesticated reindeer, that you see in Europe. That's not what we intended with the 1971 Act. The intention of that act, and it says to have free and wild horses as an integral part of the wild landscape in America, okay? Not as a managed, artificially controlled, and that's not what it says, okay? And so the intent of that act is still valid today, although how we execute to get that intent back has changed because of consumerism. Because in 71 we didn't have the competition for land like we have now. It's really intense. So fire departments, comments from people on Wild Horse Fire Brigade, for instance, I have an email from Victoria Christensen, who was she was the chief of the United States Forest Service. She retired, stepped down recently, but I talked to Ms. Christensen about Wild Horse Fire Brigade, and she agreed with me in writing that wild horses have a place in fuel reduction. She agrees. There's nobody that disagrees with that. The problem comes from the advocacy that's getting lots of donation dollars. They don't want that to end, and they just don't want a holistic solution because that just ends their business. It's their personal involvement. They have a conflict of interest because of the money. They have a conflict of interest because of the money. Now, as soon as you take money, if they had to do this for free, if we said, all right, hypothetically, that we could wave a magic wand and we go, okay, Susan Roy and Netta DeMeo, you have to do this for free of charge. Boy, they'd immediately be all about a holistic solution, because they wouldn't want to be spending endless hours and days like a lot of us do for free. You know, I mean, I've personally financed a documentary. I've funded my own study, 5-year study. That would have cost $1 million if a university was doing it. I did a 5-year study, over 11,000 hours of close observational documentation. Who's going to pay for that stuff? Well, the livestock industry is not interested in right now and having anything that would continually threaten their need for grazing. Okay, so what I'm saying is there are ways where everybody can win, but we have to acknowledge what the real problem is, and we have to acknowledge what the real solution is. We can't argue about Band-Aids. You know, I mean, the bottom line is a Band-Aid, these PZP is a terrible Band-Aid. It's not just a Band-Aid, it's a horrible Band-Aid.
It is, yeah.
So, you know, horses don't want to be, you know, and look at PZP, okay, just the administration of it, you know, stalking horses with a firearm and then shooting them, that is textbook harassment of wildlife. If you and I went to an HMA and whipped out our Daisy BB gun, which wouldn't penetrate the heart of a horse, and we started plinking at horses with a BB gun, if there was a law enforcement officer from the BLM nearby, we'd go to prison for harassment. That's a violation of the 71 Act. But because, see, the right now, the DOI and BLM and Forest Service, the corporations that are powered, that are giving them their instructions, saying, get these horses off the landscape because we want to do mineral extraction, gas, oil, ranching. We need to use this land because consumers want this stuff. So they're giving them the go-ahead. Yeah, do what you got to do. Use PZP, use this stuff, you do the roundups. And that's why when Deb Haaland stepped in, you know, I couldn't believe it, because when it was, I guess last year, at the end of 2020, Holly Gahn, who's the Washington representative for American Wild Horse Campaign, wrote this, you know, basically kissing the backside of Deb Haaland, you know, because of course she's a woman, Native American,
Right.
and they're kissing her backside. Oh, she's a great advocate for horse, blah, 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 blah. And as soon as she stepped in the door at DOI, guess what? Horses got to go, you know, and the reason is they're getting their marching orders from these big corporations. And they said, no, horses are not going to stay, they're going to go. And the reason they're going to go is nobody wants to support, at least not until now, a better plan. And that better plan is Wild Horse Fire Brigade. It's not because I thought of it. It's because it is a great plan. It's just, all I'm saying is put them back out there, make them wild in the right places. That's it. It's very simple. And, you know, by doing that, you talk about taxpayer savings. The minute, let's say we could just move all the horses out of holding, and it wouldn't be enough horses to protect all this critical forest that we've got. But if we moved them all out there, we'd save $100 million right off the get-go. Just boom, right? Forest professor, and we're in a guy named Dr. Michael Raines. He used to be the deputy director at the U.S. Forest Service and the professor of forestry at Humboldt University. He said, well, Bill, you know, your plan is interesting. He said, even if it reduced catastrophic fire by 2%, when you look at the total losses, which are, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars now in insured and uninsured losses, and then loss of wildlife and timber and damage to the watershed and to the fisheries, if you only had a 2% effect, just a teeny weeny 2%, that's $500 million a year in savings to the taxpayer. Because you talk about fire suppression, we're talking about an all-in cost of wildfire. If you can reduce that by a tiny amount, it's hundreds of millions of dollars, because we're talking billions in losses. And a lot of the losses are still untold. We don't even know in California how many more deer we've lost yet. They haven't done a census of the deer population. So, and these fires are devastating the wildlife. I mean, some of the statistics about wildfire, that for every acre of wilderness that burns, we lose between 20 and 80 animals per acre. So we're having gigafires now. One fire that's 1 million acres. We have gigafires now in California. So 1 million acres, if we just use the low number, 1 million, 20 animals per acre, 1 million acres, that's 20 million dead wildlife, 20 million animals dead. One fire. I think we had 500 and almost 600 fires in California last year. You know, so how long is that sustainable? It's not sustainable. We have to change. We have to change this. So, and the opening move in this game of chess is to rewild these horses into the right areas. It's not PZP. It's not, you know, there's all kinds of these plans. Like you look at the MAR plan. I mean, okay, that's really laughable. You got a guy who shows up from Asia, who, you know, did some good work with tigers, I guess, but moves to Canada and suddenly thinks he knows about range management in North America. Okay, well, I was a rancher. I know a little bit about range management because you had to manage your land to graze your cattle. And of course, since then, I've studied a lot of science and I've blogged, you know, in my career, I've been a logger and I've been a commercial pilot. I've done a lot of things. And I'm looking at this and I'm looking at these other ideas. Well, the MAR plan, you know, let's just put the horses back where we rounded them up from. They're not going to do that. They just spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to take them out of there. And the big corporations are the ones telling them to do it. They're not going to put them back. That's never going to happen. That's just crazy talk. And of course, range design. I mean, you know, I really admire Craig Downer, but the thing about range design, the only range design that they're going to let happen, these big corporations, the only range design they're going to let happen on these areas is the removal of predators, the removal of horses, the removal of anything that's going to compete with oil, gas, minerals, and livestock. That's it. That's the range design they're going to do. And they might enhance the transportation system in and out of these areas because obviously they got to truck minerals and gas and oil and livestock to market. That's the only range design that they're going to allow. Okay, so what do we really have? I mean, that's the thing. What plan really, honestly works? And it's got to work for everybody because these corporations are stakeholders. Whether people want to acknowledge it or not, they are very powerful, all controlling stakeholders. Any plan that you put forward for saving America's wild horses, and I mean really saving them, not harpooning them with drugs and all this other crap. Oh, well, you know, we've got this Mustang makeover thing where we're adopting horses. Oh, really? How many horses every year are actually going into good homes and adopt? How many wild horses are going in? You know, it's a tiny percentage. It's like 2-3%. Okay, 95 or more percent go to slaughter.
Yeah.
All right. So that's nothing. That's a joke. That's a canard that the government likes to, you know, gloss over this mess with. And of course these phony solutions, PZP. I mean, we've created the overpopulation problem in these management areas because we got rid of the natural predators of the horses. Of course they're going to overpopulate because you got them in an area where you designed overpopulation as the paradigm. You want cattle and sheep to overpopulate. That's the business model. So when you commingle horses in there, what are they going to do? They're also going to overpopulate. It's a man-caused problem. So how do we solve this? Not by harpooning the horses with drugs. It's you take them out of that artificial environment and you put them back where they belong, where they provide these ecological services and protect our forests and protect the fisheries and the wildlife because they're an integral part of ecosystems in North America. And that's what people forget. They need to go back out there. They're fine out there. Yeah, they do get eaten by predators, but that's by evolutionary design. We're not smarter than millions of years of evolution. We're not, okay? When you see an animal in the wilderness, they're there because evolution has tested that species in that ecosystem for millions of years and it's survived. Horses have been on this planet for 55 million years. So, and the modern horse, Ecobolus, according to the University of Helsinki, has been in North America for 1.7 million years. We've only been on the planet about 200,000 years.
Right.
So who are we to talk about another far more successful species? We know, let's talk about a successful species. Equids are highly successful. And so we need to basically clear away the detritus of this artificial arguments that are oriented around money and egos. And we need to get back to the reality of economics and basically natural history and the ecology of wild equids. And that takes us down a very simple path. They're in the wrong place. Let's put them where they belong, where they do good again and help mankind and save taxpayers money. And then if people want to have petting zoos, that's fine. We have, by relieving the wild horse problem, guess what? Now suddenly the sanctuaries can take more of the domestic horses that need rescue.
And the
And
race
they
horses,
desperately need rescue.
yeah.
All of them. I mean, there's all kinds of horses, quarter horses, race horses, this, that, the other thing. People get a horse or a pony, and it's really great. A little girl gets a pony, and then they move to the city. The dad gets a job at Microsoft, and oh, what are we going to do with this horse? Oh, well, here, give it to the Humane Society or something, and then it's at risk. So we have all kinds of great horses, domestic horses that need rescue. Sanctuaries are struggling. Sanctuaries, if we get rid of the phony nonprofits that are taking money to artificially manage and selectively breed wild horses, which is the worst thing you can do, if they get out of the circuit, and then we take those donation dollars and focus them to the sanctuaries, now we have a model that works for the wild horses and for the domestic horses, because domestic horses, we're shipping hundreds of thousands of domestic horses into Mexico, and they're being slaughtered, and a lot of them are perfectly good horses. So we can solve that problem at the same time. That frees up donation for sanctuaries. Sanctuaries are feeding horses that are waiting for a home. They need the money, not these activists that show pictures of dying horses and roundups and say, give us money, and then they go sue, and maybe they got a temporary win, but then they're overturned, and they never tell you about how they eventually lost. They only tell you about, oh, we sued, here's our donation button, have a big parade, do a couple of laps, and collect all the money they can. Or they rescue 4 horses, we're rescuing these 16, we need money. Well, what's 16 in the realm of what's going on? It's ridiculous. I mean, one life matters, I agree, but I'm not going to be focused on one life when I could maybe save 5,000 lives, okay? It's kind of like what the Coast Guard does with their rescue swimmers. They say, when you get in the water, you have to save the people that you think can survive. And it's a hard job, but you have to save the ones you think you can survive. I'm not saying that one life doesn't matter. What I'm saying is that we're spending so much time about arguing the stuff that really is the tiniest veneer of what the real problem is, instead of working at the really big piece, the really big level where we could really do something for America's wild horses. We need to get rid of those distractions. And it's unfortunate that people are funding these gold-plated nonprofits who are influencing politicians. And in fact, that might even be illegal, because when you're a 501c3, you're not supposed to be doing political lobbying.
Right.
You need to be a 501c4 to do that. And you look at some of these big gold-plated nonprofits, they're not 501c4s, okay? So why are they lobbying? Why do they have people in DC? What's going on? Are they violating IRS rules? That's a question. So, they're bending all the rules. They're doing stuff. I look at these ladies that, they may have good intentions in their heart, but they really don't know what's going on. They've never been around a real wild horse in the wilderness. They pose next to horses that are out there, and the horses are behind them 500 yards away, or by a roundup pen, or they got a PTSD. Once a horse is rounded up and castrated or treated, they've gone through PTSD. They're separated from families, their babies. They're just like, they're really smart animals. That's one thing I've come to learn. They're exceptionally smart. People think dogs are smart. Horses have a brain that's 4 times the size of a dog's brain. They're really, really smart animals. And once you make a friend with a wild horse, they always remember you. And they see you. And it's really amazing when a wild animal sees a human as a potential friend and wants to form that bond. That shows a real high level of intelligence. And so to treat them the way they're being treated, I think that's just a crime. And, I look at what's going on, and I have to wonder, has the money gotten so bad for some of these advocates that they've really no longer have the horses in the first priority. They've pushed them down because it's about buying that new car or paying the mortgage on their nice home or going to the hotels for the conventions and buying nice dinners. That's become, I think, with some of them, the incentive. And then you also look at the incentivization behind PZP. Why are they promoting PZP so hard? Is it because they're going to get a grant to harpoon all the other horses with PZP? I think so. I think they're you know, there's a backroom deal. Help us get this going, and we'll give you grants to go do it.
Well, the
It's
Humane Society has the patent for the PZP. So, and the Humane Society has what, hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, I'll just come right out and say Humane Society has been involved in a huge amount of fraud and corruption over the years. Aside from the fact that Paul Shapiro and Wayne Pacelle basically were fired or resigned as like sex offenders or whatever. There was a whole thing with the dog and cat fund with Katrina. They claim they're helping sea turtles in Florida for fundraising. That's a lie. They're claiming they're helping horses. That's a lie. So whatever little bit they do, I mean, going back 20 years with them, I know that at least they're involved in all kinds of questionable things, but they do own the patent for PZP. They've said, oh, we don't make any money. Well, no one's given this drug for free. Someone's making a lot of money. But I wanted to ask you, because I feel so bad for the wild burros. Other than acetique, I've never actually seen wild horses, and God knows I spent a lot of time out west looking for them. I can't say that I was actually in the area, you know, it's a vast area at the time, but I spent years and I would have loved to have seen them. And this was back in the 1990s, 94, 95, 96. And I told people back then, before I didn't have Facebook to post on or anything like that. And I said, it's bullshit that there's too many of them. I'm telling you. I saw nothing but cows and sheep. We had these cow jams. We couldn't move for like an hour. But as far as the horses and the burros go, hardly any. And that's also true for the bears, the cougars, the wolves, the coyotes, even the antelope. You know, I'd see one or two, but not like throngs of them. I saw lots of humans, you know, throwing trash around and overbreeding, and you know, clearly that was an overpopulated herd. So I knew even back then in the 90s, I found it very distressful that no one really took it seriously. I was thrilled when I finally saw one wild burro late at night in northern Nevada 25 years ago. And then I saw 5 or 6 in Custer State Park. So I just wanted to ask, how do wild burros, can they factor into this wild brigade? It's my understanding, I don't think we're going to even have any wild burros from what the Bureau of Land Management is just rounding all of them up. I think they pretty much get shipped to China for, God, I think even like a worse end than the horses. But is there any way that we could factor in the wild burros as well, since we don't have enough wild horses? They're equines and they're grazers too. Is that part of the plan, or could be part of the plan?
Yeah, well, of course, the burros are part of the Wild Horse Fire Brigade plan, and the reason why burros and horses are good out in the wilderness with the coeval flora and fauna is because they reseed. You know, livestock don't reseed the landscape. They have a complex stomach. You know, you're talking about cows and sheep and goats. They chew a cud. They have a complex stomach. So when they eat native flora, grasses and plants, they digest very effectively. So what comes out the back end on the ground, there's no life in it anymore. I mean, the seeds are digested. Horses and burros, though, when they eat the seeds of plants and grasses, a lot of the seeds come out, and there's studies out of Oregon State and other places talking about the survival of seeds through the digestive system of equids, which is the survival of seeds is very high. They not only do they keep the wildfire fuel grazed down, but they replant it at the same time, and by reseeding. And see, that's critical. And you're right, in the early 1900s, we had about 2 million wild horses in North America. 2 million horses in North America, and a lot of burros too. And they were doing that job. You know, they were keeping the fuel down, they were reseeding, You know, nature has a beautiful balance on how things work. Native Americans have a saying, the grass knows the horse. And what that's speaking to is the symbiotic relationship between the horse and grasses and plants, because the horse gets nourishment from the plants and the grasses, but the horse in turn helps the grasses and plants continue their life cycle by reseeding. They spread their seeds, and they reseed in a wide area because horses are moving. So they'll eat some seeds and they'll move, you know, maybe a mile or two before they'll pass seeds out onto the landscape that they got somewhere else. So they help with diversity of reseeding. They help create splinter populations of endangered flora by reseeding in unusual places. I see that up here on this landscape. Sometimes I'm way up on top of a rocky bluff and jagged rocks, but there'll be soil that was created, a little pocket of soil between some basalt. And there'll be a horse dropping there, and there'll be plants sprouting up out of that area. And then of course horse manure is, because it's so full of vegetative material and seeds that are undigested, other animals benefit from that. The birds, you'll see quail out there kicking, you know, frantically and horse manure and picking out seeds and things. They spread mycelium, you know, for mushrooms and fungi. Very critical in the microbiome of soil is the fungi. You know, fungi, mycelium is a critical thing. And that's the neat thing about horse droppings, is they're a microcosm of life. You know, you've got basically undigested vegetative material, seeds. You've got all the microbiome, all the little organisms, the bacteria and other little things that survive as they go through the horse's digestive system. And then when it comes out on the ground, it's like a little potted plant ready to go. It's got everything in there you need. And in fire damaged soils, you know, these fires are so hot they pasteurize the soil. That means it kills everything like 5 to 7 inches deep. All the microbiome, all the critters, all the bacteria in the soil are killed by the heat of the fire. That's what pasteurization is. And that's really bad because, see, dirt, it's inorganic. You know, you've just got minerals. That's all you've got. It's not alive. But when you introduce the microbiome, all the bacteria and things, what they do is they take the inorganic minerals and they chelate them. They produce acids and they chelate the inorganic minerals into bioavailable minerals that feed plants. So it's a very complex chain. And so when you have fire damaged soils, these wild horses can actually restore those soils, and the burros too. They have the same digestive system. Cattle, on the other hand, come from Africa, and over there, I'm sure the plants have developed a more resilient seed coat. So that's the shell around the seed. I'm sure that in Africa, the cattle also reseed, but the native flora there have co-evolved with the cattle, and because they know what the cattle's digestive system does, these plants have evolved to have seed coats that are resistant to digestion by cattle. So there, in that ecosystem, they are a native species, and they can reseed. Here, our plants did not co-evolve with these livestock, so they're not able to deal with it. They haven't developed the seed coat to protect their seeds. Whereas with equids, the equids don't digest the seed, so they don't even need to worry about protective seed coats. The plants are perfectly evolved with the horse's digestive system. So when you break that up, you're doing tremendous damage to these ecosystems. The other thing that people don't think about, you'll hear people argue, your wild horse plant is great, Bill, but they're going to eat all the food that the deer need. You're talking about depleted deer populations, and the horses are going to eat all the food the deer need. Well, that's also a false statement. It's manifestly incorrect. And because there's a 7-year study done in California, it was a multi-agency study. It was U.S. Forest, UC Davis, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, a study by Lawhorn and Hansen about the foods of wild horses and livestock. They did a 7-year study turns out that the grazing overlap between deer, which they call cervids, between deer and wild horses is 1%. 1% grazing overlap. That means that they're commensal. That means that they can eat at the same table in a friendly way. Whereas livestock have a 4% grazing overlap with deer. So that's 400% more. So the bottom line is livestock actually compete for the food that the deer need, not equids. Okay, so you've got a lot of misinformation that's out there. And what they're trying to do, of course, is get the hunting industry against wild horses. Actually, the hunting industry should be in favor of wild horses, because our deer population here is coming back because of our herd of horses up here. What happens is, on the landscape where you have predators, if a lion takes a horse, okay, an old horse or diseased, sick horse, that's going to feed that lion and maybe her cubs for a couple of weeks. Whereas a lion normally has to kill 1 or 2 deer every week,
Right.
to feed herself and or her cubs. So if you've got a nice population of wild equids, then guess what? It takes some of the predation pressure off the deer, and the deer do better. So there's a lot of things that people don't, because they don't live out here and see it. I see it every day. I go outside, it's all around me. I see it. You cut me, I bleed it, because it's soaked into me. So when you see the truth on the landscape, which, some of these ladies who live in these homes and apartments in cities running these big advocacy groups never see, they have no idea what's going on. They have no background in livestock or forestry, or never been around a real free roaming wild horse in the wilderness. They don't know. That's the problem we have. We have people in the discussion who do not have the requisite experience. And I'm talking about empirical experience, not reading misinformation that's been published over and over again. So you got a lot of people that write stuff, but where are they getting their information? What is their real experience? Tell me what you're, and sometimes I get into a debate, I'll run into somebody and they have an idea about horses. I go, really? You think wild horses, compete with deer, huh? How long have you lived among wild horses and seen this? 0, So they're just repeating. It's just hearsay being repeated or being rewritten. And it's really like, I can't believe the audacity of the BLM in their report to Congress, a management plan for wild horses and burros that they presented to Congress. You look on page 1 of that in the executive summary, the 5th paragraph down, is just a complete lie. It says wild horses have no natural predators.
Right.
Now that's a complete lie.
Right.
And they published it. Okay, that's actually against the law, by the way, to use taxpayer dollars to publish a lie like that. But then they have the audacity to present it to Congress like it's the truth, when it's absolutely untrue. Every predator in North America is the co-evolved natural predator of wild equids. Every one of them. So coyotes kill the babies, lions and bears kill the babies. You look at lions and bears, they'll kill the adults. Everything eats them. So that's just so untrue. But it's one of the lies that's being regurgitated over and over again. And just like they're not a native species, that's also not true.
Not true.
So it's about what we have to do is we have to demand truth, and we have to somehow have some sort of instead of like an administrator at some of these Facebook pages and things, what we need is a real curator who looks at the curriculum vitae of people that want to come on as proposed experts, because you've got everybody who's seen Black Beauty, and they watch a Nat Geo thing about horses and maybe read a couple of books, and suddenly they're a horse expert, or they've adopted a wild horse that has PTSD, and I know about wild horses, I got one. That's not working, and it's not the way it really it just doesn't work. So we need to stop having the blind leading the blind, and we need to have informed voices who can then help other people understand what the truth really is. And that's kind of my goal, is to take everything that the horses are teaching me. I didn't know this until the horses taught me. Hanging around with horses all day, every day, they teach you stuff. You just have to look, you know. And of course, going to college and being in science, I was taught to be a trained observer. I'm looking at all the little things, all the little behaviors. You know, I'm looking at the ground, the plants. You know, I take pictures of horse manure. People think I'm crazy. You know, I've got pictures of horse manure. What are you taking pictures of horse manure for? Well, it's real important. Here's why. You know, and so that's critical. And we've got to have people out there helping people. If they really love wild horses, then they really need to find the truth, and they need to take these other opinions with a grain of salt.
There are a lot of so-called experts out there, and it's exhausting, to be honest. It's exhausting to present, like the whole thing with the acetate. I mean, it's exhausting to just try to counter one little piece of it, let alone the whole thing. And of course, this has been going on for 50 years. But whenever I see the whole feral, non-feral thing, I try to tell people, don't get trapped in that bubble. It's irrelevant. The fact, whatever you believe is irrelevant. The fact is, when the law was signed in 1971, it said the horse is here today. Whether you believe they were here 5 million years ago, 500 years ago, doesn't matter. The horses here today are wild and protected, and then we move forward. So when all these, advocates and groups, whatever, start arguing over whether or not it's native or not native, I mean, basically you're just helping the people that want to get rid of them, the ranching community, because then they're like, you're right, they're not native, they're feral, et cetera, and then they just lose the whole argument. So we have a couple minutes left. So for people listening, how would they go about helping? This would be like for the layman. How would they go about helping? Hopefully they've listened to this and they realize that a lot of what they've read perhaps is not completely true or not the whole story, and that they should at least accept there's other opinions out there that are clearly more valid. So I can tell you, just in the last 3 or 4 days, especially after posting a couple of your articles, most of the comments are, I don't know who to believe, I don't know what to believe, I don't know who to support. So where can they find the articles that you've written, and what would be a suggestion how the lay person could help?
Okay, so you can find a lot of my articles just by Googling my name, William E Simpson II. And of course, or just Googling Wild Horse Fire Brigade, Wild Horse Fire Brigade. You can find a lot of information that way. And what I would tell people to do is take your donation dollars and support sanctuaries that are actually feeding and rescuing horses, and stop supporting any organization that's promoting artificial birth control and selective breeding of wild horses. That has to stop immediately. That whole thing's got, that is just a sham. So stop supporting them. I'm not looking for money. Okay, I'm not a nonprofit. I'm not a guy out there banging my tin cup, hey, send me money. I'm not doing this because I want money. I'm doing this because every morning I get up and share breath with wild mountain stallions and the families and stuff up here. And when I do that, it just pains me to think that their kin are being wiped out, because they're just such beautiful, beautiful animals and so smart. And I'm doing what I can do. Okay, I'm trying to take the message from the horses. It's not my message. They're teaching me everything I know about this. I'm just doing a little extra research to find out, okay, how does this all fit? How does this all work? But they're teaching me every day, and I still have a lot to learn. But every day I learn something from horses. So I'm just trying to bring that truth to the people, and then help them to get enlightened about how we really need to protect wildlife. Wild horses are wildlife, okay? You're not supposed to be meddling with them. It's all wrong. Not just the roundups, the PZP, the whole thing. It's wrong. We don't need a program to catch eagles and then train them how to be rabbit birds. We don't need that. That's not what this is about. You don't take a wild stallion or part of his family away from his family and break his spirit and make him some sort of a riding horse or a utility horse. That's not what this, they're wildlife. We have lots of great domestic horses. Do those horses. You know, you got 7.5 million of the United States, 7.5 million. Why are people trying to break wildlife, break their will, take the wild out of the wildlife? That's wrong. That's just wrong. It's wrong at every level. So we got plenty of horses you can go play with out there that need to be trained. You got babies from all these 7.5 million coming every day. Plenty of horses available, okay? But they need to be treated like wildlife, and Wild Horse Fire Brigade does that. It saves the horses, preserves our wilderness areas, and then the horses live wild and free as an integral part of the land, just like the Act says, okay? We just have to do a little tweak on the Act, and we have current law that allows that to happen. You asked me that question earlier, and I'll try to wrap real fast here, but under an existing law, under the the appropriations bill, there's a humane transfer of work animals where any government authority, a city, a county, a fire department, a state, could request horses from the BLM, the U.S. Forest. They got to give them to them, and then they're still protected. Okay, there's a whole long under the law, and it's in my article published. This other law we have on the books right now. They still have protections. They can't be sent into slaughter at all, and they're under the responsibility of whoever takes them under that act. So if it's a city or a county, and then see what you could do is, for instance, in Curry County, I'm working with the Commissioner Court Boyce there, who oversees the Kalmiopsis wilderness in his county. It burns catastrophically every 5 years. It's wiping out the remaining heritage trees there. He wants to put horses there. Well, he could get horses under that law. It's an existing law. And then through a memorandum of agreement with the forest, the local forest ranger say, look, I want to put a herd of 500 horses out here to make up for the lost herbivory and get this grass graze down so we don't have catastrophic fire. So you make a deal and everybody wins, because then that's like prevention. Wildfire prevention is underfunded. It's underserved right now. U.S. Forest Service spends 95% of its budget on fire suppression. Well, hold it. What happened to the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure?
A cure, right?
They got it backwards.
Right.
You know. So anyway, so there's ways to do it. We can do this immediately. So municipalities, states, Oregon Department of Forestry could request horses, and then they could put them on ODF land, and nobody can touch them then, because they're property of the ODF. They become work animals that are protected, and they could put them out in Oregon forest to protect these forests from catastrophic fire. So there's a path right now, ready to go. And on top of that, I'm trying to get legislators to talk about amending the existing 71 Act, Section 1339, which specifically prohibits putting wild horses from one HMA into another non-HMA area.
Right.
Okay, it prohibits it. We just need to amend that to say that with the exception that BLM, U.S. Forest are allowed to take wild horses from an HMA, instead of letting them being rounded up. This is what I call relocating. You take family bands, you bait them in, you move the whole family into a wilderness area. So a small amendment on that one section will allow them that tool, which they'd love to have, by the way. You know, when I talked to Victoria Christensen, she said, Bill, she says, the law says I can't do what you want to do. She says, I think you got a great idea, but I can't do it. The law says I can't. I went and looked up at 1339, sure as heck, there it is. They're not allowed to take them and move them from one HMA outside of into U.S. Forest Service. They can only put them from one HMA to another. That's it. They can't put them to where they're not existing. So she said, if we fix that law, she says, I'd be happy to put some horses up here and let them do wildfire grazing.
All right, so let me ask you real quick before we go. So my understanding from what you just said is it's possible, of course, this involves politics, which a lot of the advocate groups and advocates in general don't understand politics. But in theory, if we could lobby the Forest Service and get them looped in, then we could amend the language just in this one section, and it really sounds like maybe just a sentence, right?
It is,
And then we
I
could,
have, I
we could
actually,
do this.
I have, I have suggested language for that. I have a suggested section 1339. So it's
Okay.
in my article, one of my articles. So yeah, and what we could do is actually get all the advocates to get a hold of Kate Brown, the governor of Oregon. She's leaving office pretty soon, and I'm sure she would like to do something nice with the horses before she leaves.
Okay.
If we got a hold of Kate Brown and we go, hey, Kate, how about an executive order that says the Oregon Department of Forestry uses this existing law under the
Right.
Appropriations Act, the humane transfer of work animals, use that and then put some horses into our Oregon forest, not U.S. Department of forests, but Oregon Department of Forestry forests, and they have a lot of forests. She could do that. She could do an executive order and say, yeah, we're going to do that. And we could save 500, 1,000 horses, just boom, like that, with one stroke of the pen from Kate Brown. And that would not be a stretch for her. That would not be a stretch because she sees the devastation of catastrophic fire in Oregon. And they've tried everything. Nothing's working.
No,
They're
nothing's
doing all
working.
kinds of stuff, and they're just getting worse. The fires are getting bigger and worse and cost more money. So what could it hurt to try this program? Nothing. In fact, it saves money. So
And then that could
you know,
be used as a template for like other states to emulate as well. And like you said, I
absolutely.
mean, you could try it, and I mean, obviously it'll work, but you could basically say, well, you're already spending all this money, huge amount of loss. I mean, 20 years ago, I mean, the fires were way smaller than they are now. It's ungodly how much land burns and how many animals are killed. So basically, it's kind of like you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. We already have the horses. We're already taking them out of here. Let's just try it. So maybe I'd be happy to work with you on that, because that's definitely
That'd be great.
up my alley. I'm a lobbyist, so that's what I do. I grew up on Wall Street, so I focus on the economics. And then as I'm leaving, I'm like, by the way, this is insane and cruel, but I try to focus on the economics and politics, because honestly, unless you're like an activist, that's the language that the government and the business people and the lawyers understand. They don't care about emotion and crying. Most of them don't really care all that much about welfare, to be honest. I've been at this for a long time in politics, but they will understand, taxpayer money, fraud, waste, corruption, and a win-win situation. And if it could kind of get the advocates to calm down a little bit and save taxpayer money, geez, they could be like the heroes. So I definitely would like to work with you on that, and maybe we could get other people involved as well.
And we have a working model right here at Wild Horse Ranch. When the Klamathon fire came, it was 38,000 acres. It came right up to the edge of our grazing area here where our horses are, and CAL FIRE was able to control the fire at that point, because guess what? We had the fire laid down, less fuel, so that they were able to get in front of it and control it. And also there were areas that the horses had grazed down to like a couple, 3 inches tall. Well, those became the safe zones for the fire equipment and personnel. So they moved all their equipment into these areas, these big alpine meadows that the horses had trimmed down. There was no fuel. So that became safety zones for the firefighters. I mean, it was a beautiful, it was like a symphony of everything working together, because this fire was moving so fast and it was about ready to burn the entire Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, which is a precious resource. If they hadn't stopped it right here at our ranch, that would have been it. It would have burned through that hole, because that's so full of fuel right now. And it may have even burned down and destroyed Ashland, Oregon, which is a college town, so which is on the other side of the Cascade-Siskiyou Monument. So we have empirical evidence that it works. Not that we needed it, because you got Dr. William J. Ripple's study, but I saw it firsthand in the fire, because I was on the fire line 9 days. And I watched what was going on. I saw the fire sputtering once it hit this low fuel area. And the fire guys, CAL FIRE, did an amazing, heroic job and got in there, because they felt like they had a comfort zone. We've got this area and it's not so crazy. So anyway, yeah, let's work together and let's try to get this done. Wild Horse Fire Brigade can solve a lot of problems and save a lot of money.
Well, let's hope so, because we are at a Hail Mary. We really We really are. I never thought, 10, 20 years ago it would come to this. I thought it would have been resolved. And the other thing, and then I will say goodbye. The other thing about just irks me about the PCP is that it's sold, and still, even today, is sold as a way to stop the roundups. And I'm like, listen, sweetheart, in the 22 budget, the gazillion budget, it specifically says there's language, more roundups. So that's a lie. I said, I would be the first one to support something that started roundups if I thought the drug was safe and the horses had welfare and all that kind of stuff, but none of that exists. But your whole argument is it stops the roundups. And as you see, Wyoming, 90%? I mean, we're hardly gonna have any horses left.
Yeah, and the other thing you could say about it too is it doesn't stop the roundups, but it also leads to slow genetic death of the herd.
Yes. Right.
The PVP and the BLM, and everybody likes that because they're the walking dead. They know that they're not breeding. The stallions are castrated, the mares are infertile, and they're just going to walk around until they drop dead. And guess what? They like that because they drop dead off camera. You don't have the dramatic roundups, so that's part of their plan. And that's in my new article that's going to be coming out this week about the actual plan that's underway right now, and how these gold-plated donation-funded nonprofits are actually playing right into it. And I think some of them are actually cooperating. So
I do too.
We need to pay attention to this. Okay.
Yeah, we need some clarity and some thinking. And money definitely pollutes it. That's for sure. I lobby for free. I've never taken a penny. I'm driven like you for the cause, so to speak. So no one can come back and say you do it for, clearly I'm not doing it for the money. So hopefully we've inspired other thinking people to think before they give money or support something that they've heard or read and think that sounds like a good idea, because clearly it's not on so many levels, as has been pointed out. So I will say goodbye online,
Okay,
and I will talk to you, and hopefully we can get something going, at least in Oregon, and can use that as a template. That would be great.
Okay. Well,
great.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Oh, thank you for speaking for so long and eloquently. Hopefully your passion has inspired people. So I'll say goodbye.
All right.
Thank you.
Adios.